The stifling collar of Arturo's bespoke tuxedo suddenly felt like a hangman's noose, trapping the moisture gathering at the nape of his neck. They were moving across the polished oak floor of the grand atrium, stepping in time to a string quartet that sounded infinitely bored with its own rendition of a Strauss waltz. His hand rested on Ellie's lower back. The silk of her dress was thin, cheap. It frictioned against his palm, a stark contrast to the heavy embroidered brocades and heavy satins worn by the rest of the women in the room. Ellie smelled of synthetic vanilla body spray and the gin she had been nervously gulping since they arrived. It was a sweet, slightly sour scent that clung to the lapels of his jacket. She leaned her head against his chest, her breathing shallow, erratic. She was terrified of this place. The crystal chandeliers overhead hummed with thousands of watts of electricity, casting harsh, unforgiving light on the Botoxed foreheads and strained smiles of the city's elite. "Arturo," she whispered, her breath hot against his jaw. "People are staring." "Let them," he lied. His voice sounded confident, a baritone rumble he had perfected in boardrooms, but inside, his stomach was a knot of cold, acidic dread. He didn't love Ellie. That was the brutal, unvarnished truth he refused to look at in the daylight. He was 42, hollowed out by 15 years of a marriage that functioned more like a corporate merger, and she was 24. She was messy. She left rings on his mahogany coffee table. She laughed too loud at jokes that weren't funny, and she cried over commercials. She was entirely inappropriate for his world, and that was exactly why he was with her. She was a jagged piece of glass in a room full of perfectly smooth, suffocating pillows. He was using her to feel a pulse he thought he had lost years ago. His fingers tightened marginally on her waist. He could feel the sharp ridge of her hip bone. She wasn't eating enough again. A pang of guilt hit him, sharp and bitter, tasting like copper in the back of his throat. He dragged her into this mess. He bought her the dress, sapphire blue, an arrogant choice, and he drove her here in the Aston Martin, playing the role of the fearless rebel discarding society's rules. But he was no rebel. He was a coward wearing an expensive watch. The air in the atrium was thick, smelling of roasted pheasant, spilled champagne, and the underlying metallic tang of nervous sweat. Around them, the swirling masses of the Gala parted, offering them a wide, isolated berth on the dance floor. To Ellie, it probably felt like they were giving them room to dance. To him, an insider born and bred in this viper pit, he knew exactly what it was. It was a quarantine. William Hayes, a man whose bank Arturo had personally saved from ruin 3 years prior, caught his eye over his wife's shoulder. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. He merely let his gaze slide off Arturo, turning his body an inch to the left to effectively cut him out of his peripheral vision. Caroline, his wife, had her lips pressed so tightly together they had disappeared into a thin, white line. "I think I need another drink," Ellie murmured, pulling her head back to look at him. Her mascara was slightly smudged in the corner of her left eye. It made her look impossibly young, impossibly out of her depth. "Just one more song," he said, his throat dry. "Then we'll get some air on the terrace." He was lying to her again. There would be no terrace. They were going to finish this dance. He was going to prove to himself that he wasn't afraid of the whispers. And then he was going to call his driver and take her back to her studio apartment that smelled of damp towels and cheap incense. He was already calculating the exit strategy. He was already planning the retreat. His thumb stroked the cheap fabric covering her spine. It was a mechanical gesture. He was hyper-aware of everything but her. He felt the vibration of the cello strings trembling through the floorboards, traveling up through the soles of his leather shoes. He heard the clinking of heavy silver forks against fine china. He felt the suffocating pressure of 100 pairs of eyes dissecting his failure, his midlife cliché, his monumental lack of judgment. Why did he bring her here? The question thumped against his skull in time with the bass drum. He had told himself it was an act of honesty, a declaration, but holding her here, under the glaring lights, feeling the collective judgment of people he actually despised, he realized the pathetic truth. He wanted to be punished. He wanted someone to look at him and finally tell him he was a disaster. Ellie misread his silence. She smiled, a wobbly, genuine thing that broke his heart a little, and pressed closer. Her high heel stepped awkwardly on the toe of his shoe. "Sorry," she giggled, the sound sharp and entirely out of place over the sweeping strings of the orchestra. "It's fine," he murmured. He looked past her shoulder toward the massive oak double doors that led to the grand foyer. The valets were still moving back and forth, shadows in the dimly lit hallway beyond. He focused on those doors, pretending they were an escape hatch. If he could just keep them moving, keep the rhythm, this night would end. Tomorrow he would wake up, transfer a sum of money into Ellie's account under the guise of helping with rent, and slowly begin the cowardly process of pulling away. That was the plan, a quiet, pathetic dissolution of a quiet, pathetic affair. But plans, especially those made by cowards, rarely survive the night. Something broke the rhythm. It wasn't a loud noise. It wasn't a scream or a crash. It was an absence of noise. Near the grand foyer doors, a cluster of older women, the formidable matriarchs of the city's old money, draped in diamonds and sable, suddenly stopped talking. The cessation of their sharp, clipped chatter was like a vacuum opening up in the room. Arturo felt the shift in the air pressure before he saw anything. The hairs on his forearms, hidden beneath his tailored sleeves, stood on end. "Did you hear that?" Ellie asked, oblivious to the physics of a room turning on its axis, but sensitive enough to notice the sudden lack of ambient noise. "Keep dancing," he ordered, his voice sharper than he intended. He tried to lead her into a turn, attempting to face away from the doors. His hand was sweating so heavily now that his grip on hers was slippery, but the vacuum was spreading. It moved like a dark stain across a white tablecloth, rapidly absorbing the laughter, the clinking glasses, the false pleasantries. A waiter carrying a tray of champagne flutes stopped dead in his tracks. A flute teetered, fell, and shattered against the floor. The sound was a gunshot in the rapidly quieting room. The waiter didn't even bend down to pick it up. He just stood there, staring toward the entrance. Even the orchestra felt it. The first violinist, a pompous man Arturo paid entirely too much to hire for the evening, faltered. His bow scraped harshly against the strings, a sour, dissonant note that hung in the air like foul breath. The cellist slowed down, trying to match a tempo that was rapidly dissolving. Within seconds, the music trickled to a painful, scratching halt. "Arturo," Ellie's voice trembled now. She finally felt it. The weight of the room wasn't just pressing on them anymore. It had completely crushed them. The crowd began to part. It wasn't the slow, judgmental quarantine from earlier. This was a physical retreat. Men were grabbing their wives by the elbows and pulling them back. People were pressing themselves against the velvet-lined walls, knocking against the buffet tables. A low, collective murmur began to rise. A hive of bees waking up, agitated and terrified. Diana. The name didn't just cross his mind. It tasted like bile in his mouth. He stopped moving. Ellie stumbled against him, her cheap silk dress rustling loudly in the silence. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, pleading for him to tell her what was happening, to protect her. But he wasn't looking at her. He couldn't. His gaze was locked on the parting sea of people. The air conditioning kicked in with a low hum, blasting a stream of freezing air straight down the back of his neck. He shivered, violently, once. "Arturo, you're hurting me," Ellie whimpered. He hadn't realized how tightly his fingers were digging into her hip. He released her instantly, his hand dropping to his side as if he had touched a hot stove. He was suddenly intensely aware of his own body, the tightness in his chest, the way his heart was hammering against his ribs, irregular and frantic. His mouth was completely dry, his tongue feeling like sandpaper against the roof of his mouth. He wanted to swallow, but his throat refused to work. The whispers grew louder, disjointed fragments catching his ear. "Supposed to be in London." "Look at her. He's a dead man." He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, a pathetic, childlike instinct. If he couldn't see it, maybe it wasn't happening. Maybe he was having a heart attack. A heart attack would be preferable. He welcomed the idea of a sudden, fatal myocardial infarction. He prayed for the floor to open up and swallow him into the foundation of the building. But when he opened his eyes, the floor was solid, the lights were blinding, and the crowd had formed a perfect, silent corridor leading straight from the double doors to where he stood. At the end of that corridor, the shadows of the foyer shifted. The click of a stiletto heel against the marble threshold echoed through the atrium. It was a sharp, percussive sound. Clack, clack, slow, measured, utterly devoid of hesitation. "Who is that?" Ellie asked, her voice barely a breath. She shifted her weight, trying to hide slightly behind his shoulder. He didn't answer her. He couldn't speak. A familiar scent cut through the roasted meat and spilled alcohol. It bypassed the sweat and the cheap vanilla. It was custom-blended cedar wood, crushed violets, and ozone. It smelled like a thunderstorm rolling over a frozen lake. It was a scent that had dominated his house, his clothes, and his life for a decade and a half. His wife had arrived. Diana did not walk into a room. She commanded it to accommodate her. She stepped out of the shadows of the foyer and into the harsh light of the chandeliers. The breath he didn't realize he was holding left him in a ragged, silent exhale. She was wearing a gown of heavy, midnight green velvet. It absorbed the light rather than reflecting it, making her look like a dark, immovable pillar against the chaotic backdrop of the terrified socialites. The cut was architectural, sharp angles at the shoulders, plunging in a severe V at her collarbone. No diamonds, no pearls. Her neck was bare, an aggressive display of confidence in a room where women wore their husbands' net worth on their throats. Her dark hair was pulled back into an impossibly tight, sleek knot. Not a single strand was out of place. She stopped at the edge of the dance floor. For a terrifying, agonizing 10 seconds, she did nothing. She just stood there. Her posture was terrifyingly perfect, spine straight, chin level. She let her eyes, a pale, startling gray, sweep over the room. She didn't look at him immediately. That was her genius. She looked at William Hayes, who physically recoiled. She looked at the gossiping matriarchs, who suddenly found the patterns on the floor fascinating. She made sure everyone in the room acknowledged her absolute authority before she finally brought the executioner's axe down. Slowly, deliberately, her gray eyes locked onto his. He felt a physical jolt, a current of pure, unadulterated panic shooting down his legs. His knees actually felt weak. It was a pathetic, physical betrayal of a body that knew it was facing its apex predator. "Arturo," Ellie tugged at his sleeve. "Arturo, what's wrong?" Diana began to walk. Clack, clack, clack. The sound of her heels on the oak floor was the only sound left in the world. She didn't march. She didn't storm. She glided with a predatory slowness. Every step was a calculated humiliation, drawing out the agony, forcing everyone to watch the slow-motion car crash of his life. He wanted to step forward. He wanted to meet her halfway, to shield Ellie, to say something commanding and firm. "Diana, please, let's discuss this privately." The script was writing itself in his head, a desperate PR spin. But his feet were rooted to the floor. He was paralyzed by the overwhelming sensory reality of her. As she got closer, he could see the minute details. The sharp ridge of her cheekbones, dusted with a pale powder. The absolute stillness of her features. There was no rage in her face, no tears, no red, flushed cheeks of a betrayed woman. She looked bored. That was the most terrifying thing of all. She looked as though she had been called in to clean up a spill in aisle 4. She stopped exactly 3 feet away from them, close enough that the scent of cedarwood and violets completely obliterated Ellie's vanilla spray, close enough that he could see the faint pulsing blue vein at her temple. The silence stretched. It pulled tight, a rubber band ready to snap and take an eye out. He opened his mouth. A dry clicking sound came from his throat. "Diana," he croaked. It wasn't a word. It was a surrender. She didn't look at him. She didn't acknowledge his voice. Instead, she slowly turned her gaze to Ellie. He felt Ellie shrink. It was a physical retraction, the younger girl trying to fold in on herself, to become invisible under the weight of Diana's stare. Ellie was shivering, her bare arms covered in goosebumps, her cheap blue dress suddenly looking like a child's Halloween costume in the presence of actual couture. Diana tilted her head, a microscopic fraction of an inch. She studied Ellie the way an entomologist studies a particularly dull, common beetle. She took in the smudged mascara, the trembling lip, the death grip Ellie had on his tuxedo sleeve. "I assumed," Diana spoke. Her voice was perfectly modulated. It wasn't loud, yet it carried to the furthest corners of the dead silent room. It had the smooth, cold texture of polished granite. "That if my husband were to humiliate me in a public forum, he would at least have the decent taste to do it with someone who doesn't buy her shoes off a clearance rack." A collective, sharp intake of breath echoed from the watching crowd. Someone in the back row actually gasped. Ellie flinched as if she had been physically struck across the face. A hot, angry flush violently painted her neck and cheeks. Tears, instantaneous and thick, welled up in her eyes. She stammered, stepping back, releasing his arm. "Diana, stop," he said. His voice was louder this time, but it cracked on the second word. The bravado was a flimsy paper shield against a flamethrower. Diana slowly rotated her head back to him. The gray eyes were entirely devoid of warmth, devoid of history, devoid of the 15 years they had spent sharing a house, a bank account, a life. "Stop," she echoed, tasting the word, finding it lacking. "You bring a stray dog into the St. Regis Arturo, and you tell the management to stop when they point out the fleas?" "Don't talk about her like that," he said, a sudden, desperate flare of protective anger rising in his chest. It felt foreign, ugly. He didn't even know if he was angry for Ellie, or angry because Diana was stripping away every layer of his dignity in front of the board of directors. "Or what?" Diana asked softly. She took half a step closer. The proximity was suffocating. "What will you do, Arturo? Will you leave me?" She smiled. It was a terrifying, razor-thin stretching of her lips. "You don't have the spine to leave me," she whispered, her voice dropping so only he and the sobbing girl beside him could hear. "You don't have the spine to love her. You're just playing dress-up, and you're making a mess of my floor." She was right. The absolute, unvarnished truth of her words hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. The air rushed out of his lungs. He looked at Ellie. She was weeping now, ugly, jagged sobs, her hands covering her face, her shoulders shaking violently. He felt nothing for her in that moment but pity, and for himself, a profound, sickening disgust. Diana didn't wait for a response. She didn't need one. The destruction was complete. She reached into a small black clutch she held in her left hand. The clasp made a sharp snap. She pulled out a thick ivory envelope, embossed with the gold crest of her father's legal firm. She didn't hand it to him. She simply dropped it onto the floor between his polished leather shoes. It hit the oak with a soft, heavy thud. "My assistant has packed a bag for you. It's at the front desk of the Marriott downtown. Don't come to the house. The security codes have been changed." She finally turned her back to him. She didn't look at Ellie again. She didn't look at the crowd. "Enjoy the rest of your waltz," she threw over her velvet-clad shoulder. She walked back down the corridor of silent, terrified people. Clack, clack, clack. The crowd swallowed her, parting and closing behind her like the Red Sea. The heavy oak door swung shut with a definitive, echoing boom. He stood there on the dance floor, the white envelope resting by his feet, the sound of Ellie's sobbing, the only music left in the room. He had wanted to feel a pulse. He had wanted to feel alive. Looking down at the legal papers that meant the end of his empire, smelling the lingering scent of cedar wood and his own cold sweat, he realized he had never felt more like a corpse. Bending down to retrieve the envelope was the hardest physical exertion of his life. His right knee produced a sickening, audible pop as he squatted. The thick ivory paper was cool against his damp fingers. It felt dense, packed with dense legal jargon and the heavy gravity of his ruined life. He didn't open it. He shoved it roughly into the inner breast pocket of his tuxedo jacket, where it sat against his ribs like a block of lead. Ellie was still weeping into her hands. The sound was wet and pathetic, echoing in the cavernous, silent space Diana had left in her wake. The string quartet remained frozen, their bows resting loosely against their strings. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved to help them, or to offer a sympathetic platitude. The quarantine had evolved into an active excommunication. He reached out and wrapped his hand around Ellie's upper arm. He didn't squeeze, but his grip was firm, mechanical. "Walk," he told her. His voice sounded thin, stripped of the commanding resonance it had possessed an hour ago. She flinched at his touch but lowered her hands. Her face was a ruin of smudged cosmetics. Streaks of black mascara ran down her cheeks, cutting through the pale foundation, gathering in the corners of her mouth. Her nose was bright red. She looked like a child who had fallen on the playground, waiting for an adult to make the pain go away. But there were no adults here, just a room full of predators, and him. They began the long trek toward the double oak doors. It was an agonizingly slow parade. Every step of his leather Oxfords on the polished wood sounded deafening. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, staring at the brass handles of the exit doors. Peripheral vision is a curse in moments of profound humiliation. He could see the subtle turning away of shoulders as they passed. He caught the brief, sharp flashes of eye contact from men he golfed with, men whose mistresses he knew by name, looking at him with a mixture of terror and revulsion. They weren't judging his infidelity. They were judging his sloppiness. In their world, you could commit any sin you liked, as long as you didn't force everyone else to watch the consequences. They reached the foyer. The air out here was significantly cooler, smelling of night air and the exhaust fumes of luxury cars idling on the cobblestone driveway. The valet, a kid no older than Ellie with severe acne on his jawline, took one look at them and swallowed hard. He had likely heard the silence fall over the atrium. He knew something catastrophic had happened. "The Aston," he said, handing him his ticket. His hand was shaking so badly, the paper fluttered. "Right away, Mr. Pendleton." The kid ran. He actually sprinted across the driveway. Ellie stood 3 feet away from him, her arms wrapped around her waist, shivering. The sapphire blue dress offered zero protection against the autumn chill. He should have offered her his jacket. It was the gentlemanly thing to do. It was the script. But he didn't take it off. He needed the jacket. He needed the armor, however thin and useless it had proven to be. He was cold, too, a deep, bone-rattling cold that started in his stomach and radiated outward. The Aston Martin pulled up, its powerful engine emitting a low, aggressive growl that felt entirely out of place. It was a car designed for a man who owned the world. He opened the passenger door for Ellie. She climbed in awkwardly, her long legs tangling in the cheap silk, hitting her elbow against the door frame. She didn't complain. He walked around the rear of the car, breathing in the sharp, acrid smell of burnt high-octane fuel. It grounded him slightly. Sliding into the driver's seat, the leather interior, which normally smelled rich and comforting, suddenly felt suffocating. It smelled of hide and chemical treatments. He pressed the ignition button, and the dashboard illuminated, casting a harsh, pale blue light across their faces. He put the car in gear and pulled away from the grand atrium. He didn't look in the rearview mirror. The drive was agonizing. The city streets were slick with a recent, light drizzle, reflecting the neon signs of late-night pharmacies and empty diners. The rhythmic thwack-thwack of the windshield wipers was the only sound in the cabin for the first 10 minutes. The adrenaline was beginning to crash out of his system. It left behind a sour, metallic taste in the back of his throat, and a dull, throbbing headache situated squarely behind his eyes. His hands gripped the suede-wrapped steering wheel so tightly his knuckles ached, yet he felt entirely disconnected from the machine he was operating. "She destroyed you," Ellie said, Her voice wasn't wet with tears anymore. It was flat, nasal, congested. He kept his eyes on the road. A traffic light a block ahead turned yellow, then red. He slowly applied the brakes, feeling the heavy, expensive calipers bite into the rotors. She didn't even raise her voice, Ellie continued, turning her head to look at him. He could feel her stare. It felt like a physical weight against the side of his face. She looked at me like I was a piece of trash stuck to her shoe. And you just stood there. Ellie, please, he rasped. No. The word was sharp, biting. The illusion had shattered. He was no longer the Silver Fox benefactor, the exciting older man rescuing her from the mundane reality of her life. She was looking at the man behind the curtain, and she was appalled by how small he was. You told me you were separated. You told me she didn't care. You told me... I lied. The admission slipped out of his mouth before he could catch it. It was the most honest thing he had said to her in 6 months. She let out a short, harsh breath that sounded almost like a laugh. Yeah, you did. The light turned green. He pressed the accelerator. The silence returned, but it was a different breed of silence now. It was thick with contempt. The cheap vanilla body spray she wore had mixed with her nervous sweat, turning the scent slightly sour in the confined space of the sports car. He cracked his window an inch, letting the damp, freezing city air howl into the cabin. They arrived at her apartment building in the gentrifying part of the warehouse district. The streetlights flickered here. The brickwork was stained with decades of industrial soot. He pulled the Aston to the curb, the low-profile tires scraping lightly against the concrete. He put the car in park. His hands moved to his breast pocket. He bypassed the thick ivory envelope and pulled out his silver money clip. It was a reflex, a terrible, insulting, deeply ingrained reflex. Whenever a situation became messy, whenever an interaction reached its expiration date, he applied capital to the wound. He peeled off $500 bills. He didn't look at her as he held the crisp paper out over the center console. For a cab tomorrow, he said, the words tasting like ash. Or whatever you need. Ellie looked at the money. He expected her to slap his hand away. He expected her to spit on him, to scream, to finally unleash the rage she was entirely entitled to feel. Instead, she reached out and took the bills. Her fingers were freezing. She folded the money neatly in half and tucked it into the small, beaded clutch she had bought specifically for tonight. Don't ever call me again, Arturo, she said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. She opened the door. The interior lights flared, blindingly bright. She stepped out onto the damp pavement, slamming the heavy door shut behind her. The sound resonated through the chassis of the car. He watched her walk up the cracked concrete steps to her building, unlock the heavy glass door, and disappear into the dimly lit lobby. She didn't look back. He sat there on the idling curb for a long time. He was alone, truly, spectacularly alone. He put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, heading toward the only place he was allowed to go. The Marriott downtown was a towering monument to corporate transient life. It was a massive slab of glass and steel, entirely devoid of personality, designed to house traveling software salesmen and mid-level consultants. He handed his keys to a valet who looked utterly exhausted, not even bothering to register the make of the car. He walked through the sliding glass doors into the lobby. The air here was artificially heated and aggressively circulated. It smelled of industrial floor cleaner and the faint, stale scent of complimentary coffee that had been sitting on a burner since 3 p.m. The night auditor at the front desk was a man in his late 50s with a comb-over and a name tag that read, Gary. He was tapping away at a keyboard when Arturo approached. "Can I help you, sir?" Gary asked, not looking up immediately. When he did, his eyes snagged on Arturo's bespoke tuxedo, his messy, loosened bow tie, and the pale, sweating pallor of his face. "Arturo Pendleton," he said. His voice was a dry croak. "I believe there is a bag for me, and a reservation." Gary tapped his keyboard. "Ah, yes, Mr. Pendleton. The reservation was made 3 hours ago by Mrs. Pendleton's office, room 412. And yes, a courier dropped off a bag shortly after. 3 hours ago." The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. She had booked the room and packed the bag before he even picked Ellie up for the gala. Diana had known. She had orchestrated the entire evening. She had let him dress up, let him parade his indiscretion into the most public venue in the city, knowing exactly how she was going to annihilate him. The sheer, terrifying efficiency of it made his stomach pitch violently. Gary placed a heavy, dark brown leather duffel bag onto the marble counter. It was his favorite weekender, the one he took on hunting trips to Montana. Gary slid a plastic key card across the surface. "Elevators are to your left, sir." He grabbed the thick leather handles of the duffel. It was heavy. He picked up the key card and walked toward the elevators without thanking him. The ride up to the 4th floor was agonizingly slow. Piped-in instrumental pop music drifted from a hidden speaker, cheerful and vapid. He stared at his reflection in the polished brass doors. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning. The skin around his eyes was bruised and sunken. The expensive fabric of his jacket hung limply on his shoulders. Room 412 was exactly what he expected. Standard king bed, mass-produced floral art on the walls, a cheap laminate desk, and a television bolted to a swivel stand. The silence in the room was absolute, a stark contrast to the humming, vibrating energy of the grand atrium. He dropped the duffel bag onto the luggage rack at the foot of the bed. It landed with a heavy, muffled thud. He unbuttoned his tuxedo jacket and slipped it off. The ivory envelope fell from the inside pocket, landing softly on the beige carpet. He stared at it for a long moment before picking it up and tossing it onto the bedspread. He moved to the duffel bag and unzipped it. He needed to see what she had packed. He needed to see how thoroughly she had erased him from their home. Inside, meticulously folded with tissue paper to prevent wrinkles, were his 3 tailored business suits. His charcoal brioni, the navy pinstripe, and a lighter gray wool. 7 crisp white dress shirts, still wrapped in their dry cleaning plastic. 6 silk ties, coiled perfectly like sleeping snakes. 2 pairs of polished Oxford shoes in separate cloth bags. He kept digging. Underneath the professional armor lay the casual clothes. 2 pairs of raw denim jeans, a cashmere sweater. And then, at the very bottom, his fingers brushed against something unbelievably soft. He pulled it out. It was a faded heather gray t-shirt from a college rowing team he hadn't thought about in 20 years. It was paper thin, ridiculously comfortable, and the only thing he ever wore on lazy Sunday mornings when it rained. His breath hitched. A sharp, physical pain lanced through his chest. She hadn't just thrown his clothes into a bag. She had curated his departure. She had packed the suits so he could continue to function in the corporate world. the world where she was currently dismantling his reputation. And she had packed the t-shirt to let him know that she knew every intimate detail of his life, every comfort, every routine. And she was formally revoking his access to all of it. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. He dropped the t-shirt back into the bag and stepped away, feeling suddenly nauseous. He walked to the bed and sat on the edge. The mattress was firm, institutional. He reached for the ivory envelope. He broke the heavy wax seal, her father's firm's crest, with his thumb. Inside was a thick sheaf of legal documents printed on heavy, watermarked paper. He didn't need to read the legalese to understand the mechanics of his ruin, but his eyes scanned the bold headings anyway. Dissolution of marriage, division of assets, temporary restraining order. That last one made him pause. He read the paragraph beneath it. She had successfully petitioned a judge, undoubtedly a friend of her father's, to bar him from entering the primary residence in the Palisades, the summer house in Nantucket, and, most devastatingly, she had frozen all joint liquid assets pending a formal audit. He was effectively locked out of his own life. He had the clothes in the duffel bag, the Aston Martin downstairs, and the personal checking account that his salary was deposited into. A salary that was paid by a board of directors who had just watched his wife publicly neuter him. They would demand his resignation by Monday morning. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. He stood up, the papers sliding off his lap onto the floor. He walked into the bathroom and slapped the light switch. The harsh fluorescent tubes flickered to life, illuminating the stark white tiles and the large mirror over the sink. He gripped the edges of the cold porcelain vanity. He leaned forward, staring hard into his own eyes. He was waiting for the grief to hit. He was waiting for the tears, the righteous anger, the burning desire to fight back. But there was nothing. The well was completely dry. He felt a profound, echoing emptiness. The adrenaline had burned out the last of his emotional reserves. He realized, staring at the gray skin and the hollow eyes reflecting back at him, that he wasn't grieving the loss of his wife. He was grieving the loss of the illusion. He had thought he was the master of his universe. He had thought the affair with Ellie was a bold assertion of his autonomy. Instead, he was just a predictable, pathetic, middle-aged cliché, a pawn on a board controlled by a woman infinitely smarter and more ruthless than he could ever hope to be. A wave of intense, violent nausea rolled over him. He dropped to his knees on the cold tile, grabbed the edges of the toilet bowl, and retched. His stomach convulsed, but he had eaten nothing at the Gala. All that came up was a burning mixture of bile and the 2 glasses of single malt scotch he had consumed before leaving the house to pick up Ellie. It burned the back of his throat, smelling of peat and acid. He spat into the bowl, coughing violently, his eyes watering. He stayed on the floor for a long time, his cheek resting against the cool porcelain of the tank, listening to the hum of the mini-fridge in the main room. There was no orchestra here, no whispers, no scent of cedarwood or cheap vanilla. There was just the smell of bleach, the taste of bile, and the absolute terrifying quiet of a man who had successfully dismantled his entire existence in a single evening. He closed his eyes, but the darkness offered no relief. The image of Diana's gray eyes, utterly bored as she watched him drown, was burned into the back of his eyelids. He was alive, but as he pulled himself up from the bathroom floor to crawl toward the stiff hotel sheets, He understood exactly what the men at the gala had seen. They hadn't been looking at a disgraced colleague. They had been looking at a corpse that hadn't yet realized it was dead. Sunlight did not gently wake him. It stabbed through the microscopic gap in the Marriott's blackout curtains, a laser beam of harsh yellow hitting directly across his bloodshot eyes. Monday morning. He had spent the weekend in a state of suspended animation, ordering lukewarm club sandwiches from room service that he chewed mechanically and spat into paper napkins. He hadn't showered. He hadn't opened the laptop sitting dead on the laminate desk. He had merely existed, a biological organism burning oxygen in room 412. But Monday demanded a pulse. He stripped off the wrinkled dress shirt he had slept in. It smelled of stale sweat and the metallic tang of fear. The hotel shower had 0 water pressure. It spat tepid water at his chest while he stood there, leaning his forehead against the cheap plastic surround. He grabbed the miniature bottle of complimentary body wash. It smelled heavily of synthetic grapefruit. He scrubbed his skin until it was red, desperately trying to erase the lingering phantom scent of cedarwood and violets that his brain swore was still clinging to him. Dressing felt like putting on a costume for a play that had already been canceled. He chose the charcoal Brioni suit. The wool was heavy, an armor he desperately needed. He knotted the silk tie perfectly. Muscle memory is a terrifying thing. His hands could tie a half Windsor even while his central nervous system was in full collapse. The drive to the financial district was a blur of brake lights and morning rain. The Aston Martin, which usually felt like an extension of his own power, now felt like a stolen vehicle. He parked in his designated, aggressively policed spot in the underground garage of the Pendleton Hayes building. His name was still painted on the concrete wall. He wondered, with a morbid curiosity, how long it would take the maintenance crew to power wash it off. Stepping off the private elevator onto the executive floor, the silence hit him. It wasn't the shocked, terrified silence of the grand atrium. It was the calculated, busy silence of a corporate triage unit. Phones were ringing, but people were speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Keyboards clattered. His assistant, Claire, was at her desk. She was a woman in her late 50s who practically ran his life, a woman he had bought expensive cashmere scarves for at Christmas. She didn't look up when the elevator doors chimed. She kept her eyes glued to her monitors. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap. A cardboard banker's box sat perfectly squared on the edge of her desk. "Good morning, Claire," he said. His voice was a gravelly whisper. He cleared his throat, tasting morning coffee and bile. She flinched. She actually flinched at the sound of his voice. "Mr. Hayes is waiting for you in conference room B," she said to her keyboard. "He asked that you not go to your office." He looked down the hall. The heavy glass door to his office, his sanctuary, his empire, was locked. A security guard in a cheap navy blazer stood awkwardly near the frosted glass, examining his cuticles. "I see," he murmured. Conference room B was the windowless room they used for terminating mid-level managers. It was small, painted an aggressive shade of eggshell white, and smelled perpetually of dry erase markers. Richard Hayes was sitting at the head of the small veneer table. He was William Hayes's older brother, the chairman of the board. He was wearing a deep burgundy tie, a tie Arturo had bought for him in Milan 3 years ago after they closed the acquisition that made his family obscenely wealthy. Beside him sat a man Arturo didn't recognize, a lawyer, the executioner's assistant. "Sit down, Arturo," Richard said. He didn't stand. He didn't offer his hand. He looked at Arturo with the weary exhaustion of a man dealing with a leaky pipe in his basement. He pulled out a cheap mesh chair and sat. The plastic armrests dug into his forearms. "We'll make this brief," Richard started, adjusting a thin manila folder on the table. "Effective immediately, the board requires your resignation as CEO." There was no preamble, no, "How are you holding up?" just the surgical strike. "On what grounds?" he asked. It was a pathetic, reflexive defense. He knew the grounds. Everyone in the city knew the grounds. "Morals clause, Section 4, Paragraph B of your contract," the lawyer spoke up. His voice was nasal, entirely devoid of emotion. "Public conduct detrimental to the reputation and operational stability of the firm." "I had a personal dispute with my wife at a social event," he countered, leaning forward, trying to summon the phantom ghost of his authority. "It has nothing to do with the operational stability of this bank." Richard sighed heavily. He took off his wire-rimmed glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Arturo, don't insult my intelligence. Diana's father is the senior partner at Sterling and Vance. They handle 70% of our corporate litigation. Her brother sits on the oversight committee for the state regulatory board. You didn't just have a public spat. You humiliated the daughter of the man holding the leash to our legal protection." He put his glasses back on, his eyes boring into Arturo's. "Diana called me at 7 o'clock Sunday morning. She didn't ask for your head. She just politely informed me that her father's firm would be reviewing their client portfolio this week, and she hoped we wouldn't be affected by any sudden lack of representation." A cold, creeping numbness spread from his chest down to his fingertips. Diana hadn't just blown up his marriage. She had systematically, methodically dismantled his professional safety net while he was vomiting in a hotel bathroom. "So, she blackmailed you," he said, his voice hollow. "She leveraged her assets," Richard corrected smoothly. "Something you used to be quite good at before you lost your mind over a girl who looks like she should be serving lattes at a strip mall." The insult stung, a sharp slap across the face, but he had no defense. Richard pushed a single piece of paper across the veneer table. It was a typed resignation letter. It cited health reasons. It was neat, tidy, and completely sterile. "Sign it," Richard said softly. "You get to keep your vested options. Your severance package is intact, though God knows your wife's lawyers will freeze it by noon. If you force us to fire you, we invoke the morals clause, and you walk away with absolutely nothing." He stared at the thick black line at the bottom of the page. The pen sitting next to it was a cheap plastic ballpoint, chewed at the end. He owned a Mont Blanc fountain pen that cost more than the furniture in this room, and it was locked behind a glass door 20 feet away. He picked up the chewed plastic pen. The ink skipped on the first letter, forcing him to trace violently over his own name. Arturo Pendleton. "Your personal items have been boxed," Richard said, already standing up, the folder tucked under his arm. "Security will escort you to the garage. I suggest you take some time off, Arturo. Move to Florida. Play golf." He walked out. The lawyer followed. He sat alone in the humming white room. The dry erase board behind him had a faint smeared graph on it, an echo of a meeting he had led just last week. He reached up and loosened his perfect half-Windsor knot. It felt like a noose. Security did not let him carry his own box. The guard, a kid who couldn't look him in the eye, carried it to the Aston Martin, placing it carefully in the trunk. He watched the heavy lid snap shut. That box contained 15 years of his life. A crystal paperweight. A framed photo of him shaking hands with the mayor. A ridiculous novelty mug he bought on a trip to Chicago. Rubble. He didn't drive back to the Marriott. He couldn't face the smell of synthetic grapefruit and the heavy silence of room 412. Instead, he drove. He drove aimlessly through the city arteries, letting the morning traffic dictate his path. The rain began to fall harder, drumming a frantic, chaotic rhythm against the roof of the car. The wipers smeared the water across the glass, distorting the skyline he used to think he owned. Eventually, he found himself in a neighborhood he didn't recognize, somewhere deep in the industrial sprawl of the city's south side. The streets here were cracked, lined with rusted chain-link fences and faded brick warehouses. He pulled the car into the gravel parking lot of a diner that looked like a relic from the 1970s. The neon sign in the window was half burned out, buzzing aggressively. Pete's. He killed the engine. The silence in the cabin was immediate and suffocating. He got out into the rain. He didn't have an umbrella. The cold water soaked instantly through the shoulders of his Brioni suit, pasting his hair to his forehead. He walked to the glass door and pushed it open. A bell above the door jingled sharply. The diner smelled of old frying oil, burnt coffee, and damp wool. It was a heavy, comforting smell. There were no chandeliers here, just buzzing fluorescent tubes covered in a thin film of grease. The linoleum floor was scuffed and peeling at the corners. A waitress behind the counter, a woman with deep lines around her mouth and a faded pink uniform, glanced at him. She didn't register the bespoke suit or the expensive watch. She just saw a wet, tired man. "Sit anywhere, hun," she called out, gesturing vaguely to the rows of red vinyl booths. He slid into a booth by the window. The vinyl was cracked, held together by a strip of silver duct tape that scratched against his slacks. He stared out the rain-streaked window at his car. The Aston Martin sat in the gravel, an absurd, beautiful alien machine in a wasteland. It belonged to a ghost. The waitress dropped a laminated menu onto the Formica table. It was sticky. "Coffee?" she asked, already pouring a thick, black sludge from a glass carafe into a heavy ceramic mug. "Yes, thank you." He wrapped his hands around the mug. It was scalding hot. The heat seeped into his frozen palms, a sharp, grounding pain. He brought it to his lips. It tasted like ash and copper, bitter and harsh. It was the best thing he had tasted in 3 days. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking slightly. Without the constant hum of the office, without the adrenaline of the gala, without the terror of Diana's quiet rage, he was finally experiencing the physical crash. He reached into the inner pocket of his wet jacket. His fingers bypassed the phone that hadn't rung all morning and pulled out his leather wallet. He opened it. His corporate credit card was gone, undoubtedly deactivated by Richard before he even signed the paper. His personal black card sat in its slot. He pulled it out and stared at it. The heavy metal felt useless. Diana's lawyers would have frozen the accounts the moment the banks opened. Behind the cards, tucked into the leather fold, he found a single, crumpled $20 bill. He pulled it out and smoothed the wrinkled paper against the sticky Formica table. He pressed his thumb against the face of Andrew Jackson. $20. And the clothes on his back. And a car that required a fuel pump he likely couldn't afford to replace. He wasn't a CEO. He wasn't a husband. He wasn't an arrogant rebel playing a dangerous game. He was a 42-year-old man sitting in a damp suit in a greasy diner, nursing a burned cup of coffee, waiting for the rain to stop. The bell above the door jingled again. A truck driver walked in, shaking the water off his heavy canvas coat. He sat 2 booths down from Arturo, burying his face in a newspaper. He didn't look at him. The waitress didn't look at him. The world outside the window kept moving, entirely indifferent to the catastrophic implosion of Arturo Pendleton. He took another sip of the bitter coffee. He rested his head against the cold glass of the window. For the first time since he stepped onto that polished oak floor at the Grand Atrium, the suffocating knot in his chest finally loosened. It wasn't relief. It wasn't hope. It was the profound, empty silence of a house after the tornado has passed, taking everything with it, leaving absolutely nothing left to lose. If you felt the sting of that cold corporate boardroom or the bitter taste of that diner coffee, let me know in the comments. We all face moments where the illusion shatters. Drop a like if this grounded, raw journey resonated with you. Share it with someone who appreciates real storytelling, and hit that subscribe button for more deeply human narratives delivered straight to your feed. See you next time.